I had a friend in high school, up until 10th grade, Leroy. Leroy was the nicest guy. He's just the nicest kid. He lived on a farm about 2 miles from me. And he struggled. He struggled greatly with the academic life of school. Didn't do well at all. But it didn't faze much for Leroy. He enjoyed company. He enjoyed having lunch and going out to recess and doing whatever and talking. My father was also a teacher in the high school, 7 through 12. And he had Leroy in several of his classes. And during parent-teacher times, he would talk to Leroy's parents and just let them know how Leroy was doing. Well, there was one time that he called the parents in, a special meeting with them, and told them, he said, Leroy is really struggling in school. All Leroy really wants to do is work on the farm with his dad. He has failed so much. I mean, if we were to fail as much as Leroy, we wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. The best thing for Leroy is to take him out of school and let him do what he loves to do. Because every day he comes to school is marked with failure. And pretty soon that failure turns into an identity of failure. And we can't have that for Leroy. He's a good kid. So please, as his teacher, ironically, let him stay home. Leroy was one of the lost in the school. Not so much as in terms of friends, although he had very few. In terms of expectations and what was expected of him as a student, he was a little lost. He never found his place in academic life. But in the farm life, he was found. He was great. He loved what he was doing. He loved doing the chores and bringing the hay and feeding the cattle and do whatever. That was his niche. His walls of academia had crumbled and fallen, and now a new life had begun for him. We remember today the 15th anniversary of the 9/11 towers crashing down, and the Pentagon, and the plane crashes in Harrisburg, and all those things that happened. And there was so much strife, there was so much confusion, and so many lost people at that time. And lost in several different ways. There were people who lost loved ones, either in the buildings or those helping to pull out of the buildings. There was a loss of identity as this country was viewed as strongest ever, invulnerable to anything. We're lost. There's a loss in the sense of who's going to protect us? Why didn't someone protect us from this? There's a deep loss as we searched for meaning in an event that was meaningless. And the question was, where is God in all this? And sometimes I think that God was ever more present in those moments than any time else. Because we saw people of faith running into buildings they didn't have to. Helping people they didn't need to. Giving however they could to people they didn't even know. I was in Allentown an hour and 45 minutes away, and I wanted to do something, but to go into that time would be a glut of people. So my friend and I decided to go to the blood center and donate blood because we knew for sure there had to be a need for blood. And as we got there, we were one of the first ones. After a while, the place was full, packed with people wanting to do or give something of themselves for this. And I look around the room, I think, this is really where God is and what God is doing. Some senseless act has got some sense to it in some ways. The presence of God comes in mysterious ways, in unexpected ways. I imagine the people in the wilderness, with Moses, have been wandering for a long time. I imagine they were feeling pretty lost. Their homeland was gone. Their identity of people as people of God was waning. When are we going to get there? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? I'm sure Moses heard that over and over again. And as he's on the mountain, they decide they're going to take it into their own hands. So they build this calf, of course, and they worship the calf and say, we've got to have something tangible that we can hold on to with our hopes and dreams and something that we know is there. And then, of course, we have the conversation with Moses and God, which I find is interesting. I find it interesting that God in history actually talks to people, and they kind of try to talk God out of doing something radical. God had talked to Abraham about Sodom and Gomorrah, that evil city, and Abraham said, wait, if you find 40 people, will you save it? If you find 30 people, will you save it? 20, 10. Okay, and then God remits. And of course, all heck breaks loose and God punishes. In this case, God really wants to let those Israelites have it, and Moses reminds them of his promises. You brought us out here. You promised to take us to a new land. You had to know this might happen. People lose faith. Maybe that was God's test of Moses. How well is this servant of mine? How well does he know me? How well will he know to stand up for the people that he cares about? How much on mission is he on task for? He fights for his people. Maybe that was the test, and God was saying, good and faithful servant, you understand that I am a God who keeps promises, that I am a God who is merciful and gracious. And even though I'm really, really angry right now, they're worth saving that you show that I am merciful to you. We get lost. Part of the kids' sermon was, when you go to Great America or you go to Disney World and you got a group of kids, don't you want to set them off bright, fluorescent yellow shirts and maybe tall hats or something so they know that that's our kid? And what happens if one of the kids get lost? Well, you take the other chaperone and say, you watch these kids. We'll set up a search party to go get them. Or that soldier in a different land that's lost, and the rest of the regiment is not going to go home until they get him and bring him back. No one is left behind, right? The lost never stay lost. Always faithful, right? Always loyal. Well, the loss is an occurrence that happens to us quite frequently. And we get thrown for a loop. And we wonder what we're going to do next. We search and search and search, and we try to find the hope that's sometimes lost. But it's not. The Sioux that are fighting to keep the pipeline out of the reservation, away from the reservation, people have experienced loss their whole lives, for centuries now. They understand loss. Pine Ridge, they understand loss to suicide for kids. They understand what it means to lose an identity, what it means to lose part of their land. They lost. And yet they remain steadfast. They remain strong. They continue their culture despite the losses. There's something strong in that. And we understand in some ways because we become stronger in our losses too. We depend on each other. We depend on God more. Like I said before, the confirmation is a regaining, a reminder to us. Through the words of the confirmation, we understand that we're God's. God has marked us, and we're never lost. God is always there. God will always be that shepherd who searches for us and finds us and rejoices because he has found us. And as we celebrate this affirmation of baptism, we understand that we are part of that plan. We are part of that search party to help. That we don't sit back idly and wait for God to do all this stuff, but God works through us to work for justice, to do what is right. And Jesus, eating with all these people that weren't supposedly clean, and they seemed to be lost, and yet Jesus tells these Pharisees, what's the matter with you? I know you understand the laws of the land, forwards and backwards, but do you know them in your heart? Are you able to address that in your lives? Are you able to embrace people who seem different than you, who seem unclean? And the Pharisees, on their part, are just trying to hold on to the laws of Moses that they hold so dear, that they've been brought up with, that this part of their lives that they can't shake because it is who they are as an identity of people. And so they confront Jesus and say, these are the laws. What's wrong with you? It says you can't do this. We're right, right? Pharisees are right? Well, you might think so on the surface of it, if you follow the strict rules of what it says in the laws of Moses. And yet Jesus pushes by that. Is he belittling the righteousness of God? The holiness of God, is he just kind of tossing it off to the side for his own personal compassion journey? Well, we see that Jesus often goes beyond the laws or maybe bends the rules a bit for compassion's sake. For Jesus' ministry was worth more than the theology of the people of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the elders. He bucked the system out of compassion. When I was a chaplain at Lutheran General Hospital during my seminary days, I was a young guy. I wasn't married yet, and I was with newborn intensive care and high-risk pregnancy. Ironic. I picked it on purpose so I could understand. Well, there was one couple in their early 20s, and their baby was stillborn at 22 weeks. And what they wanted me to do was to baptize this baby. And all the theology I've been taught in seminary was that baptism is for the living. It's too late for this baby to be baptized because it's no longer living. It won't do any good for this baby, right? I remember one of the chaplains telling me, he said, sometimes ministry trumps theology. And out of compassion, I baptized the baby for the parents' sake. I knew that God had this child enveloped in God's loving hands all along. It was now time for the parents to feel loved, the love of God that they were so missing. The questions, the hurt, the loss that they felt. They needed some sort of sign, of some sort of comfort to give them. So this little baby, splashing water on its forehead, little baby boy. You can understand that compassion often trumps theology. Is it right? Jesus often did that. Jesus often went past theology. And we often do too. Because we care about each other. And when Jesus boils it down, love God, love your neighbor. When he told Peter, asked him, what should I do? And Jesus said, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. He was talking about this very thing. And we know in our hearts that we've done this. Because it's meaningful. The faith of a people is a tricky thing sometimes. I've been at a church where the congregation would sing, holy, holy, and would do it not the way it's supposed to be done. And someone would say, that's not right. And I would say, that's their faith. They're doing it right because it's meaningful to them. That's how this whole theology evolves and how liturgy evolves, is you take things that are meaningful to you and you keep doing them. In these three parables, well, the prodigal son was the next parable, that God's mercy breaks through human restrictions of how God should act towards sinners, which is all of us. So the basic issue between Jesus and the Pharisees remains the same. Are some people outside the limits of God's mercy? And I think we can say no. No one is outside God's mercy. Jesus dragged that cross. He pushed it along. He scraped and scrabbled and stumbled and fell and dragged it onto the hole where he was to be crucified. And he was nailed to the cross, and he was experienced loss of many, many things. And yet, through that act, he freed us from the depths of sin. He freed us from the depths of ourselves sometimes. Jesus comes to us and saves us and frees us and shows us a new and compassionate way to live for God. So all this Zoe is going to tell us in 5 minutes or less up here when she comes up with her family. No, I won't do that to you, Zoe. You're fine. But as a reminder to us that this is what Jesus has done for us. Provided us community and sends us out to fight for those who can't fight for themselves, to look for justice and peace and whatever else. We believe this because Jesus has said it is so. And God has demonstrated this throughout the history of the Gospels and throughout the history of the Bible and history of the people of God. None are lost. And if we feel lost, we remember that God saves, that God searches, and God frees all of us. Amen.